The day they locked the door for the last time, they carried everything they had left in the back of an old pickup truck. 42 years of life reduced to a few boxes. The house they once filled with memories now belonged to someone else. The savings they spent decades building were gone. Medical bills, repairs, one crisis after another. At their age, most people would have looked for help, but they didn't. Instead, they drove out to a small piece of land nobody wanted. At the edge of that land stood a rusted Quonset hut. The curved metal shell looked abandoned. Wind pushed through holes in the walls. The floor was cold concrete. No insulation, no furniture, no comfort. Friends thought they had lost their minds. "How can you live in that?" one neighbor asked. They didn't answer, because when they looked at the rusted metal structure, they didn't see a shelter. They saw a second chance. What happened next surprised everyone who had ever doubted them. Because the place that once looked like the end of their story slowly turned into something no one expected. For most of their lives, Harold and Martha believed they had done everything the right way. They worked hard, they saved carefully, they avoided risks. Their life was never luxurious, but it was stable. And at their age, stability meant everything. Harold had spent 35 years working as a mechanic in a small local garage. His hands were always rough, his clothes often stained with oil, but he took pride in fixing things. Martha worked at the town library for nearly 3 decades. She loved quiet spaces, the smell of books, and helping children find stories they could fall into. Together, they built a simple life. A small house near the edge of town, a garden in the backyard. A routine that rarely changed. Mornings started with coffee at the kitchen table. Evenings ended with the television quietly playing in the background. They never expected to become wealthy. But they expected to grow old peacefully. Then things began to change. It started with Harold's health. At first it was just fatigue. Long days in the garage felt heavier than before. Soon it turned into doctor visits, tests, and long drives to the hospital in the city. The medical bills followed quickly. Insurance covered some of it, but not enough. While they were dealing with that, the house began showing its age. A leaking roof after a storm, plumbing problems in the winter, repairs that could not be ignored. Each problem by itself seemed manageable. Together, they became overwhelming. Their savings started disappearing faster than either of them expected. For the first time in their lives, Harold and Martha began making decisions based on survival instead of comfort. They cut every unnecessary expense. They sold furniture. They stopped traveling to visit distant relatives. Still, the numbers refused to balance. The day they realized they could no longer keep the house was quiet. There was no dramatic argument. No sudden breakdown. They simply sat at the kitchen table and looked at the final notice together. Harold folded the paper slowly and placed it back in the envelope. Martha stared at the window above the sink. Outside, the small garden she had planted years ago was beginning to bloom for spring. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. Harold didn't answer immediately. For most people their age, the next step would have been asking family for help, maybe moving into a smaller apartment or assisted living. But Harold had never been comfortable depending on others. Instead, he opened an old notebook where he had been writing numbers and ideas during the previous weeks. "I found something," he said. Martha looked at him with quiet curiosity. It wasn't another house. It wasn't even really a home. It was an old Quonset hut sitting on a small, forgotten piece of land outside town. The structure had once been used for storage decades earlier. Now it was rusted, empty, and unwanted, but it was cheap, cheaper than anything else they could afford. Harold slid the photo of the metal structure across the table. Martha studied it carefully. To most people, it looked like the last place anyone would want to live. But Harold wasn't seeing rust and broken panels. He was seeing something else, a place where they could start again. When they first drove out to see the Quonset hut, The road itself felt like a warning. The paved streets of town slowly turned into gravel. Then the gravel turned into a narrow dirt path surrounded by tall grass and scattered trees. The place felt forgotten. Martha sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the land stretch out on both sides of them. "Are you sure this is the right place?" she asked. Harold looked down at the piece of paper with the directions written on it. "This should be it," he said. A few minutes later, the metal structure appeared in the distance. At first, it looked smaller than the picture Harold had shown her. The curved roof was covered with patches of rust. Some sections of the metal panels were bent from years of wind and weather. Weeds had grown high around the edges. The hut looked less like a building and more like something left behind. Harold parked the truck and stepped out first. The air was colder out here. The wind moved freely across the open land and rattled the thin metal walls. Martha followed him slowly. When she stepped inside, the sound of their footsteps echoed against the concrete floor. The inside was completely empty. No insulation, no walls, no plumbing, just a long curved shell made of metal. A few narrow beams of sunlight slipped through small gaps in the panels above them. Dust floated quietly in the air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Martha walked slowly across the floor, looking around at the space. The building felt large but hollow. The wind pushed faint whistles through the cracks. "This used to be a storage building," Harold said. His voice echoed softly. Martha ran her hand across one of the cold metal walls. The surface was rough with rust. "It's going to be freezing in the winter," she said. Harold nodded. "And hot in the summer," he admitted. She walked toward the open doorway and looked back across the empty structure. Anyone else standing in that space would have seen a problem. No electricity, no water, no comfort. But Harold's eyes were moving differently. He wasn't staring at what was missing. He was measuring. He paced slowly across the floor, counting steps. Then he looked up at the curve of the roof. "We could frame a small living area along that side," he said, pointing toward one wall. Martha watched him quietly. "A kitchen over there," he continued. "Bathroom near the back. Insulation along the roof. We could seal the gaps." The more he spoke, the more the empty space began to change in his mind. He wasn't describing a shelter. He was describing a home. Martha stood still for a long moment, listening to the wind outside and Harold's quiet plans echoing through the metal shell. To most people, the hut would have looked like the end of the road. But standing there, she began to understand what Harold had seen in that photograph at the kitchen table. Not a rusted building, a blank beginning. The first few weeks were harder than either of them expected. The Quonset hut had no comfort waiting for them. The moment they moved their few boxes inside, the emptiness became real. The concrete floor stayed cold even during the day. At night, the metal walls carried every sound of the wind across the open land, but Harold never slowed down. Each morning he woke before sunrise, just like he had during his years at the garage. He made coffee using a small camping stove they had brought with them. Then he studied the notebook where he had drawn rough plans for the inside of the hut. Martha watched him quietly. The man who had spent decades fixing other people's machines was now trying to rebuild an entire home from a rusted shell. They started with the smallest changes. Harold patched the holes in the metal walls using sheets he bought from a salvage yard outside town. He tightened loose panels and sealed cracks where cold air pushed through. The work was slow. His hands were older now, and every movement took more effort than it once had. But he refused to rush. Meanwhile, Martha focused on making the space feel less empty. She swept the concrete floor every morning. She arranged their small pieces of furniture along one side of the hut, creating a corner that felt almost like a living room. Their bed sat behind a temporary curtain made from an old blanket. It wasn't much, but it was enough to sleep. Some evenings they sat together in folding chairs near the open door, watching the sky grow darker over the empty fields. The quiet out here was different from the quiet of their old house. It felt wider, deeper. One afternoon, a pickup truck slowed down near the edge of the property. A neighbor from down the road stepped out. He leaned against the truck door and studied the hut for a moment. "You two really planning to live in that thing?" he asked. Harold wiped his hands on a rag. "That's the plan," he said calmly. The man shook his head slightly. "Well, you've got your work cut out for you." He drove away a few minutes later, leaving behind the faint sound of gravel under his tires. Martha watched the truck disappear down the road. "They think we're crazy," she said quietly. Harold smiled faintly. "Maybe we are," but the work continued. By the end of the second month, wooden frames began appearing along the inside walls. Harold built them piece by piece using scrap lumber he found at local construction sites and salvage yards. The empty metal shell slowly started to divide into rooms: a small kitchen space, a corner for the bathroom, a narrow hallway. The changes were still rough, but something important had shifted. The Quonset hut no longer felt like an abandoned building. It was beginning to feel like a place someone had chosen to stay. By the third month, the Quonset hut no longer looked completely abandoned. From the road, it still appeared rough. The metal shell was still rusted in places. The curved roof still carried the marks of years of weather, but small signs of life had begun to appear. A narrow wooden porch stood near the entrance now. Harold built it using old planks he found at a demolition site outside town. The wood didn't match perfectly, but it was strong enough to stand on. Next to the door, Martha placed 2 flower pots she had brought from their old house. The plants were small, but the green leaves stood out against the faded metal walls. Little by little, the hut began to look less forgotten. People passing on the nearby road started noticing. At first, it was only curious glances from drivers slowing down. Then one afternoon, a neighbor stopped his truck again. This time he didn't stay in the driver's seat. He walked up to the porch and knocked lightly on the metal frame. Harold opened the door. The neighbor looked around the inside carefully. "Well," he said after a moment, "this place looks different already." Harold smiled slightly. "We're getting there." The man stepped inside for a moment. The wooden frames dividing the rooms were now covered with insulation panels. A small kitchen counter had been built along one wall. It was simple, made from reused cabinets Harold had repaired himself. "You did all this?" the neighbor asked. Harold nodded. "Still a lot left to do." Word slowly spread around the area. Some people came by out of curiosity. Others brought small things that might help. A leftover window from a renovation project, a box of old tiles, even a used wood stove someone no longer needed. Harold never asked for help, but he never refused it either. Martha began making tea whenever someone stopped by. The tiny kitchen corner often filled with quiet conversation while Harold explained what he planned to build next. With each passing week, the inside of the Quonset hut continued to change. The bathroom finally had working plumbing. The kitchen sink was connected to a small water line. A proper wall separated their bedroom from the rest of the space. The transformation was slow, but it was steady. One evening, Martha stood outside near the porch as the sun lowered across the fields. The curved metal building behind her reflected the soft orange light. For the first time since they lost their house, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not relief, not comfort. Something quieter. Hope. Inside, Harold was adjusting the wiring for a small light fixture he had just installed above the kitchen table. When he switched it on, the warm glow spread across the room. The rusted structure that once echoed with emptiness now held something different. Not just walls and furniture, but the quiet evidence of people refusing to give up. By the time winter arrived, the Quonset hut had changed more than anyone expected. The metal shell still stood where it always had, curved against the wide sky. But the inside was no longer empty or cold. Harold had finished sealing the last gaps in the walls. Thick insulation now covered the metal ribs of the structure, and the wood stove near the center of the room kept the space warm even on the coldest nights. The small kitchen Martha had arranged felt lived in now. Shelves held simple dishes. A kettle sat on the stove. The old wooden table they brought from their previous house stood near the middle of the room, often covered with tools, notes, or cups of coffee. The hut had slowly become a home. What surprised people most was how different it felt inside compared to what they expected from the outside. Neighbors who stopped by for the first time often paused at the doorway. From the road, it still looked like a rusted storage building, but inside, the space was bright and warm. The curved ceiling gave the room a sense of openness. Harold had installed a row of windows along one side, letting sunlight spill across the wooden floors he had laid down over the concrete. The transformation had not gone unnoticed. More people began driving by just to look. Some slowed down their trucks and stared for a moment. Others stopped and asked Harold questions about how he had managed to turn the structure into something livable. A local contractor visited one afternoon after hearing about the project. He walked slowly around the interior, examining the framing, the insulation, the wiring Harold had installed. "You built all this yourself?" he asked. Harold nodded. The contractor shook his head slightly. "Most people would have torn this place down." Harold leaned against the counter and looked around the room. "I didn't see something to tear down," he said. "I saw something unfinished." Martha stood near the window, listening quietly. She had noticed something else happening over the past few weeks. People who came to visit rarely left quickly. They stayed longer than expected. Some sat at the table for coffee. Others walked slowly around the space, studying the curved walls and the careful way Harold had shaped each room inside the metal shell. The hut had become more than shelter. It had become a story. Word eventually reached someone from the small local newspaper. One afternoon, a young reporter arrived with a camera and a notebook. He asked Harold and Martha how they ended up living in a Quonset hut. Harold answered simply. "We lost our house," he said. "So we built another one." The reporter looked around the room again, writing quickly. "What you built here," he said, "is something most people wouldn't even imagine." Harold didn't respond right away. He just looked at the curved ceiling above them, the wooden beams, the small kitchen, and the window where Martha's plants were growing stronger each day. Outside, the wind brushed softly across the metal walls. Inside, the space felt steady, and the story of the rusted Quonset hut was only beginning to spread. By the following spring, the Quonset hut no longer felt like a temporary solution. It had become part of the land. The rusted metal that once looked tired now blended with the tall grass and open sky. From a distance, it still looked simple, but anyone who stepped inside quickly realized it was something very different. Sunlight moved gently across the curved ceiling each morning. The windows Harold had installed filled the space with light. Martha's plants had spread across the shelves near the kitchen, their leaves reaching toward the warmth. The place felt calm. The small newspaper article had quietly traveled farther than Harold expected. People from nearby towns began stopping by just to see the unusual home they had read about. Some were curious. Some were inspired. A few older couples arrived one weekend and asked Harold questions about the structure. They walked slowly around the interior, studying the wooden frames and the way he had shaped the rooms inside the curved metal shell. One man shook his head in amazement. "We've been trying to downsize for years," he said, "and you two did it with almost nothing." Harold smiled politely but didn't say much. He had never built the place to impress anyone. He had built it because they had no other choice. But over time, something surprising happened. The Quonset hut became more than a house. Neighbors began gathering there for small visits. Someone brought extra garden seeds for Martha. Another neighbor helped Harold improve the rainwater system outside. The land around the hut slowly filled with small touches of life. A vegetable garden appeared behind the building. A narrow path of stones led from the porch to the edge of the field. A wooden bench sat beneath a tree where Martha often read during the afternoon. The place that once looked abandoned had turned into a quiet center for the small community nearby. One evening, Harold stood outside watching the sunset stretch across the open land. The curved metal roof reflected the soft orange light. Martha stepped out onto the porch beside him. "Do you ever miss the old house?" she asked. Harold thought about it for a moment. The kitchen where they once had breakfast every morning. The rooms they had slowly filled with decades of memories. Then he looked back at the Quonset hut behind them. The porch he built with his own hands, the warm light glowing through the windows. The garden Martha was tending only a few steps away. "I miss the memories," he said quietly. "But not the house." Martha nodded slowly. They stood there together as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared above the fields. The rusted building that once looked like the end of their story now held something entirely different. Not loss, not survival, but proof that sometimes starting over doesn't mean building something bigger. Sometimes it means building something stronger.